Beth, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you, Lauren, so much for having me. I'm so excited. I love any opportunity I get to talk kids ministry with friends and even just to imagine incredible kids pastors and kids ministry leaders that are going to get to be a part of our conversation today in the future. So I'm just honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yay, I'm so excited. Why don't you kick off our episode today just by telling us a little bit about you? You've been in ministry for so many years, have so much experience. So give us a little insight to who Beth is, maybe how you got started in the world of kids ministry, and tell us about where you're serving currently.
No, that is so great. Hi, everybody. I'm Beth, also known as Sean's wife and Rachel and Tyler's mom. I also have a Cavapoo named Oliver. This is so funny, but when your kids get grown, you think you're not going to be that person that gets the small dog. And then my husband and I look at each other, we're like, oh my goodness, we have become that couple. But yes, I'm
Yes.
happily married to my high school sweetheart for 28 years. We have two grown children. I have an awesome son-in-law as well that God blessed our family with. But yes, I am so incredibly blessed. I'm 49. I just own it, and I started on church staff when I was 22, actually, right out of college. And in my early years of ministry, I spent 8 years, 8 to 10 years actually leading worship. My background is in music. When I came to Church of the Highlands, this is where I serve. I've been on staff here for 17 years. It's the first time, or as we say in the South, a hot minute. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm coming up on 17 years in one house, which is such a gift. But when I came on staff here 17 years ago, I actually was working in adult ministries. I was hired to be an executive assistant for one of our lead team pastors, and we were thick and like small groups, premarital counseling, our conferences, growth track, all of those things. And I say all this to say part of my story is 13 years ago, I got a call, said, hey, Pastor Chris wants to meet with you. And that was not, I was in meetings with him occasionally, but that was an unusual call. Like, oh my goodness,
So you're like,
my
oh
senior
no, am
pastor
I in
wants to meet
trouble?
with me. Like,
Yes.
am I going to the principal's office? But I wasn't. But the conversation was actually, we had had a transition in our kids ministry, and he said something. He said, Beth, I've hired from outside the church. And I really felt like the Lord showed me that the person was in the staff, in the house.
Hmm.
And he said, and I thought of you. And so actually I accidentally, but God's providence and hand brought me into kids ministry. I tell people the story all the time. How did I become children's pastor at Church of the Highlands? My answer is baby praise. So I say this to say, when my children were little, I was a part of a program at our local hospital where one of my mentors would like do like pregnancy fitness classes. Then you'd have mommy and me classes. Well, this was so impactful for me as a young mother that I always said, one day I want the Lord to allow me to do that in a church setting. So when I came to Highlands as a staff member, we have a free market small group system. So you can lead any kind of group you want, your volleyball groups or your Beth Moore Bible studies. Well, I started Baby Praise. And to this day, for 17 years, I still sit on a floor with moms and children, and we sing Itsy Bitsy Spider and Jesus Loves Me. And there's a point where I go around the room with the mirror and we sing a special song about how God loves each child by name. And actually, it was, as Pastor Chris has called it, my Itsy Bitsy Spider small group that led him to say, I know Beth's a great leader, and she wouldn't have been serving as a small group leader, right, with women and children if she didn't love this audience. So I
Hmm.
became the children's pastor of a very large megachurch at that time with zero experience in kids ministry.
Oh
So that's
my
a whole
goodness.
nother story to itself. But that was my journey, and it was God's gift to me that he allowed me to love. I see how he worked it together. My love of kids, my love of families was already happening, in marriage ministry and other things I was doing, and then my desire to build healthy teams, like kids ministry, has been nothing but a gift. And so that is my journey. Um, you know. 17 years on staff, 13 years into kids. I now lead our women's ministry as well. I oversee a couple of areas of the church, but kids is still like my passion, and something I love working in and on every single day. It's the most diverse team in any church. We could talk all the things,
Hmm.
and it presents such an incredible opportunity for us as leaders. So, yeah, that's my story.
That is awesome. I never knew that. I didn't know that you started at something totally different
Yes.
and ended up being in kids ministry. And I think, I mean, there's so many God things to that story of one, just going back to the very beginning of like, you've been faithful at a church for 17 years, which is so special for your community and for just kind of like the long obedience. And that's such a gift. But also just, I don't know, I feel like listening to your story, it's like, oh, you just kind of said yes to the things that God placed on your heart, whether that was worship ministry or marriage ministry or baby praise. I mean, like, how sweet is that? Just to, one, I mean, there's so many things, but like being on a staff that allows you to do something that's outside of your specific job description. Because normally, like,
Yes.
a baby praise type of things would fit into a kids ministry role, but you're over here doing other things and you're like, hey, I'm passionate about this. This greatly impacted me as a young mom. Could I do this? And that just opens so many doors for your gifting to come alive in so many ways. I do want to know, when you moved into a kids ministry role, how were you guys multi-site at this point, or were you still at one location?
We were multi-site. I think when I stepped into kids, we were probably 6 to 8 locations is
Okay.
probably my guess. It's been a minute, but we were definitely multi-site, and I inherited a
Yeah.
large staff, and so a lot was like, let me get in and get to know this team. I feel
Yeah.
like I became a student, and I hope I probably one of the biggest lessons that I would want any kids ministry leader that I think I've learned is like to stay a lifelong learner. So like I
Mm-hmm.
stepped into a role. I knew Highlands. I knew my senior pastor's heart. I knew our culture. I have a lot of vision. I'm a visionary, like by I see things like I'm a
Yeah.
futurist in that way, but really I needed to learn from the people who are already doing it longer and better. So I spent
Yeah.
months just asking questions, writing things down, and to this day, probably one of my best practices is that every year without fail, I take one weekend and I go visit another local church. And I am a student, and I have
Yeah.
spent the last 13 years going to other churches and learning things about what they do that makes their kids ministry great. And trying to just learn. And I think that God allowing me to step into such a large role at a large church, having no experience, was super humbling and intentional because
Yeah.
it postured me in such a way that I'm still constantly curious about kids ministry, and I'm very curious about learning and being in those environments. So yes, it was, let's go in and learn some stuff.
Seriously. And I think that's such a good posture to have, because you could have gone in and said, well, I've been placed in this role, so I'm just going to make all the decisions and be in charge. But instead, you went in with a posture of humility and said, yes, God has put me in this position as a leader, but there's so much I don't know. And
Right.
going to your staff and saying, hey, you've been doing this for a couple years. What are some things that I need to know that I don't know? And I love being the idea of being a lifelong learner. And even years and years and years after doing ministry, it's constantly changing. Like, whether you
Yes,
like it or not, how ministry was done 10 years ago is not how ministry is being done today. And so there's more to learn, and kids are changing. And so I think kids ministry
absolutely.
is this like constant ebb and flow of different things that people are research that's coming out, different philosophies and different strategies that people are finding are helpful. And so it is a role where you have to learn, or else like your families will just move on by you in a lot of
That's
ways.
correct. That is
Yeah.
correct. It is such an exciting time, and I 100% agree with everything you said. That's the one of the things we always want to work on is how are we learning, and to not rest in patterns or methods, but make sure
Yeah.
that we're on the cutting edge of really understanding this generation and what our families need. So yeah, that's
Yep.
my story.
That's so awesome. I love it. Okay, so while we're on the topic of learning new things, this generation of families, like, you have seen 2 decades of just ministry life. and
Sure.
families come and go and kids and all that entails pre-COVID, post-COVID, like all the wild things that we have experienced in ministry. I would love to know that. I would love to know, what are you seeing in families? What are you noticing in today's families? Why do you think, or maybe what do you think they need from the local church right now in this cultural climate that we're living in? And maybe like, what are some things that you guys are doing? What practices are you implementing in your church to reach the families of today?
Yeah, no, that's such a big question. And I think I would start with some of the incredible strengths that I'm seeing of our millennial parents. And so
Yeah.
recognizing one, I think just how in tuned they are emotionally to their children,
Mm,
more so than like me as a Gen X mom. Your millennial parents are they're in tune with their children's feelings in a way that I think is very beautiful and very healthy, but also can be that sometimes they're making choices based on what a
yeah.
6 year old feels more so than my generation would have done previously. I say
Mm-hmm.
all that to say, like, what we're seeing is like a mother could actually be having great stress if her 6 year old doesn't like our kindergarten room more so than we would have seen 10 years ago. Right. And so, as
Right.
children's
Right.
ministry leaders, they are so in tune with their children's feelings, so emotionally connected, which again, I think has incredible strengths, but
Mm-hmm.
also one of the potential, perhaps negative byproducts of that when it comes to how they engage with church and church experiences is that can
Yeah.
be a lot of times more than any time I've seen in the last 20 years, that 8 year old is dictating where mom and dad go to church or whether mom and dad go to church more so
Right.
than I've seen. That's been a significant
Interesting.
shift. And we've seen
Yeah.
that more post COVID, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
just anxiety levels are perhaps higher. The return to church, I feel like, we we are so blessed in my context. Now, I mean, our families are certainly back, but patterns of attendance and some of those things have changed.
Yeah.
So I want to highlight a couple of those things. I think there's just some attendance pattern changes. Also, just that strong connectivity to emotions, again, which can be a
Mm-hmm.
strength, but also could potentially be a weakness. We need to be aware of it. I think parents are looking for more help from the church than they were several years ago. I know
Yeah.
we were part of some great research from Barna, the Guiding Children research that came out with Barna and One Hope. That was coming out in 2019. And it's so
Okay.
interesting how predictive it was of kind of what we were going to see, where parents were saying, I actually want the church to help speak into some of these issues and things we're seeing in society. I think they're wanting more information, more communication than they did
Yeah.
5 years ago. And I would say this just to kind of encapsulate. I know we'll talk about children because I think that's a whole nother unique thing about what we're seeing in kids. But if I could just
Mm-hmm.
sum it all up in this with parents, I think one of the byproducts of COVID and isolation, what we know about Gen Alpha is there are social lags. We know there's
Mm-hmm.
social delays. We know there's some language delays. Like these are things that
Yeah.
are, verified by pediatricians and sociologists. And so parents are super concerned about their children's relational and emotional health,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
relational and emotional connectivity. So, one of the things that we ask ourselves in Highlands Kids is what are we doing to help our children make friends at church?
Yeah.
Like because the biggest thing mom and dad are looking for is they want that happy child, and they want that child that actually wants to go into the room. And because we're dealing now with perhaps more social anxiety, more emotional delays, or relationships, soft skills, we would call them, some
Mm-hmm.
soft skills are lagging,
Yep.
especially with our younger Gen Alpha kids coming up. We have to ask ourselves, what are we doing? And we've done a lot of things to address that. I don't know if I need to pause and give a second for you to respond. But I think it's in that space of a relational and emotional health. I have a theory right now that if the Church of Jesus Christ can step into some of these spaces that are
Yeah.
felt need for mom and dad, that we can
Mm-hmm.
be that trusted voice where perhaps right now parents all across America are looking like, who can I trust right now? And if we can step in
Exactly.
and offer solutions to these relational, emotional needs that they're feeling with their children, I think it could be one of the most significant opportunities we have for evangelism in the North American church. Like I feel so
Yeah.
strongly about that, that potential to reach unchurched parents or to reach seeker parents by being a place that actually helps their children thrive emotionally and relationally. Because
Yeah.
that's the need right now.
Exactly. And that's so good. And I think that totally aligns. I'm going to link the study that you just talked about, the Barna and One Hope study,
Yes.
so that people can see it. But also so much that has come out even post-COVID.
Even
We think of
since. Yes.
Lifeway study and even the things that we've seen shift in curriculums recently of
Yes.
this
Love to talk about that.
high of this high intentionality behind relational excellence and having a very relationally focused ministry to where
Yes.
it's not so much as a child comes into a classroom and we're going to hit him with content right away. It's no, let's stop and actually try and build a relationship, not just kid to kid, but kid to volunteer and kid to
100%.
kids pastor, and how that is so important. Even when I think this is Awana's research of like, even for this, the sense of belonging has to come before they are
Yes.
even open to hearing the gospel.
Yes.
And I think parents are very they have a high awareness of, is this adult safe for my child? And I think kids ministry leaders should be thinking about that conversation and that mindset for parents. I think that's super helpful.
Yes, I mean, I think the belong, believe, become,
Yep.
research from Awana. And I think even just to highlight another resource that I think is incredible, but Mark McCrindle's book, Generation Alpha, which was
Mm-hmm.
kind of like he was the sociologist and researcher that first coined the term Gen Alpha. Just the more we can learn about this group of children, but I think that's where parents are. And if I could speak to kind of what you were saying, just as far as the relational aspect, I know for us in 2019, we radically shifted our entire approach to elementary ministry. And this was pre COVID, but I could already
Mm-hmm.
sense, I was saying to my staff, I'm like, what about the shy child or the introverted child? This was
Yeah.
before, we were even seeing some of the social anxiety that kids are facing today. But we would always say we're a church of small groups. I mean, we're known for small groups. We have more people in small groups than we have coming on Sunday. Like that is who we are at Church of the Highlands. But it was interesting because, like most traditional kids ministries, we, especially in elementary, we have this, game time, this engaging worship, a teaching video slash live, both elements, and then
Mm-hmm.
you had your last kind of small group time at the end of the service, a very
Yeah.
traditional children's ministry flow that honestly served the church well for probably 10 or 15 years. But I
Mm-hmm.
kept feeling this angst in my spirit that this is not perhaps what kids need today. And then, based on research about Gen Alpha, even attention spans, I'll give you this example. My daughter is 26, my son is 23. They grew up watching iCarly, SpongeBob, right? Like you watch a 30-minute episode of something.
Yeah.
What do children today watch? They watch a 3 minute
Bluey.
YouTube, right? Or even like elementary kids are watching 3 to 4 minute clips on YouTube
Yeah.
Kids. Like it's not even the way that they engage information and content is so different. And so,
Mm-hmm.
to that point, we radically transformed our curriculum. We radically transformed our services to ask ourselves, how relational can we be in every
Yeah.
aspect of the service? And we do nothing in more than 5 minute increments. So our kids are in small
Interesting.
groups the entire time. But so there's, of course, we have praise and worship. That's not a group, but even games, we're asking ourselves, how do we group this game? Everything is
Yeah.
designed to build relationships. But from the very beginning of the main point being introduced, they talk for 5 minutes and then they watch a 5 minute clip. Then they talk
Mm-hmm.
about it for 5 minutes. Then they watch a
Yeah.
context video that lays out theology. Then we talk for 5 minutes. And what we've seen is in Gen Alpha, the need to ask questions, the need to
Mm-hmm.
conversate, the need to publish how they feel about things,
Yeah.
the need, and there's so much biblical, like when you look at like the rabbinical style of learning, you look at how Jesus taught in the Gospels, he always asked questions, he always told
Yeah.
stories. And we ask ourselves, are we talking at them too much? No, let's create spaces where we present a thought or an idea
Mm-hmm.
in 5 minutes, and then they actually, with their small group leaders, discuss and talk about that. And it
Yeah.
has radically transformed not only how our children learn, but how engaged they are in the opening of the word, and in building relationships with one another. But it's been a joy to pair great research with saying, can we do this differently and see how
Yeah.
this generation responds?
Yeah. I'm curious. I think what comes to my mind is those people, those kids ministry leaders who are like, well, this has worked. This has always worked. And almost this mindset of, well, they should be able to sit and listen to a volunteer teach for 10 to 15 minutes. And I'm curious, like, because that is where my brain is going of like, well,
For sure.
it's like, how do you balance this new research that's coming out? You don't want to, it's like, you don't want to follow the new trend because you don't want to just leave what's working kind of in the past. It's like, how do you kind of hold this new research and this new generation that's coming up and not completely overhaul your entire ministry? I don't know. How do you balance the two of those?
Totally. I think, here we're blessed to be the home of Highlands College. And even as someone who teaches for the college, I'm watching now how even we are designing classroom experiences where actually no lecture is a full lecture anymore. You stop in increments and have, yes, and
Yeah.
have pause and reflecting because I'll just say this philosophically. Um, Generations have not, people aren't suffering for a lack of knowledge. They're
Mm-hmm.
suffering for a lack of revelation,
Yeah.
right? Like I can get online and watch church all day. Like I can watch some of the
Totally.
best. We've never had more access to teaching, theology, training even adults.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we? I guess I would step back and say philosophically, what I know Generation Alpha needs is they have an inherent distrust for institutions. This is true for Gen Z and Gen Alpha, for
Yeah.
something being told at them because when your whole life you've been in the internet and there's a lot of competing voices telling you what is true. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that's the reality of this generation that I did not grow up with, but that
Yeah.
is their reality. And so, because of that, I think we do have to be willing to consider other methods of learning because their issue is not going to be that, well, someone told them the truth. No, they're going to have to discover truth. And that is
Exactly.
very right. And so that means in our services and our spaces, however we do it, we've got to create safe spaces for kids and youth to open God's word with people they trust and talk about like how this affects their life and is
Mm-hmm.
this really true and is Jesus who he says he is? Yes, he is, but we discover that together in community. The Bible, it's so beautiful. Like I think so much in our Western like American mindset, we think I need to have my quiet time and read the Bible. 100% we do. I had mine this morning. But the Bible is always also meant to be opened in community. It was
Yeah.
always also always meant to be opened and heard and discussed. So I think regardless of the method we choose, I think this generation is going to require less talking at them. I think we still present the truth, but we've got to ask ourselves, are we creating spaces for them to ask questions and discover and process out loud with their
Yeah.
peers and with leaders who are discipling them? I think they need that more than previous generations.
That's so fascinating because even I'm thinking about my own church context. We actually just shifted the way that we do Sunday mornings, and so we do small groups first, and
Yeah,
inside the context of small group, they hear the story for the first time, and then they go to large group and hear it again in large group. And I help write the curriculum for Sunday mornings, and we just switched it up to where it's like we read a couple verses, then ask a question, then read a couple verses, then ask a question. And I'm like, oh
great.
yeah, doing it right. But it totally makes sense because I love what you said about how they're hearing truth in quotation marks, truth
Right.
everywhere. And
Yes.
they're hearing it at them of like, you need to believe this, you need to believe this, you need to believe this. And so if a teacher at church on Sunday mornings was just to say, you need to believe this, well, then who do they believe? Like they have to be taught, and this is where we weave into like Bible literacy, is like they have to
Yes.
be taught how to read God's word and read it for themselves and engage with it, not just hearing it, but
Yes.
asking those questions. And because if if a volunteer is just saying, here's what's true, well, that voice is just going to blend in with the hundreds other voices that they're hearing on social media and YouTube and at school, it's sports. And so it's like, how can we make Sunday morning different? Well, it's get kids into God's word for themselves and let them read it and ask those hard questions and engage with it in a
Yes.
way that they can't engage with the social media influencer on YouTube.
100%. Our theme verse for the ministry here for Highlands Kids is 3 John 1:4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. And
Yeah.
so, it's like, how are we creating spaces for them to discover truth? And truth is a person. His name is Jesus. He has revealed himself through his word, right? He
Mm-hmm.
confirms his presence in our life by the power of the Holy Spirit. He will reveal the truth to them. And so, yeah, so we're always on that journey of, are we creating spaces? And so I do think that is a definite trend in kids is, regardless of how you choose to do it, are we really providing spaces for relationship? Are we providing spaces for their questions to be asked, for
Yeah.
them to take ownership of their faith journey? And that picture being painted is just such a beautiful picture. We say this, we believe children learn best in circles, not rows.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a defining statement for our ministry. And what we mean by that is the power of being with peers, being with leaders who love you, and let's go on a journey to discover what Jesus has to say about this and
Yeah.
what he has to say about who you are, and that we're inviting them into God's big story.
Mm-hmm.
Such a beautiful thing.
Yes. Okay. We're going to kind of shift gears a little bit because when people hear this, we're right on the cusp of fall launch, everybody coming back to church. We've been talking about creating new ways for kids to feel welcome and feel like they belong and all of those important relational aspects. But I would love to know, and this is from your experience in the past, but also present, what do you guys do to help welcome either new families or maybe families who have been gone all summer who are like, oh, school's starting, we should jump back into church rhythms? How are you helping these families jump back into attending church? We mentioned briefly at the beginning of just there's like different attendance patterns happening. And
Sure.
so as we're heading towards the fall, what are some tricks or tips or words of encouragement to just continue to journey alongside these parents who are either brand new to church or maybe they come to church once every 6 weeks and we want
Right.
them to be engaged, we want them to be plugged in? What does that look like?
No, I think it's such a great conversation and something that I think that we're constantly tweaking. I'll kind of walk everyone through our new family process, and then something that we have been doing since COVID that I think has been very successful. When a family comes for the first time, first of all, I think all of us are always working on our websites, but I think it's important to realize that most millennial parents, they don't go to a restaurant without Yelping it, or you know what I mean. Like everything a
Yep.
millennial parent does is being reviewed before they ever come to it, whether it's a store or a restaurant, any experience, a hotel. Well, the same thing is happening with our church, and so we actually,
Mm-hmm.
having that pre-registration online where a new family can pre-register their kids ahead of time. Actually, we have a lot of parents that use that, which tells me that our millennial mom and dad that are checking us out, they're going to our website first, right? And
Yeah.
so again, I wouldn't have done that, but that is current pattern. So have we made it easy for them to pre-register? When they get there, whether they pre-registered or not, is it very obvious where I go if I'm new for the first time?
Yep.
Like literally, I'm new. But one of the things that we found is identifying the child in a way that allows us to guarantee as best as we can that that child has a great experience.
Mm-hmm.
For us, that is, we have new friend stickers that go on. Every child just says, I'm a new friend. That way, every leader in the room understands to, again, pay extra attention to that child. We match them in elementary with a buddy, usually a middle school. That's a great serve opportunity for some of our junior JV leaders to be a
Yes.
buddy for a first time child in our kindergarten or 4 and 5 year old environments or in elementary environments. Match them up. But a couple of things that we have done to try to wow families is every child leaves with a pretty significant gift that day, like a full on swag bag of Highlands Kids things. Parents also also leave with a gift. We have a gift for mom and dad. We have a prayer magnet for them that's going to outline if they never come back to our church again. Here's 30
Yeah.
days you can put on your refrigerator. This is how to pray
Oh,
for your
wow.
child. Just, a virtue and a scripture. And then we also equip them with our parent guide. This is our version. You can, if any of you want to check that out, you can go to highlandsresources.com. All of our resources are free for our church. So from our
Ooh,
kids
fun.
curriculum we make to any resource, if you want our volunteer handbook, please take it. Put your church's name on it. You can have it. But all of that is available at highlandsresources.com. But I highlight the parent guide because that's an important thing to give to parents in the sense that here, mom and dad, here's our promise to you. Like, this is what we're about as a ministry. This is actually our
Mm-hmm.
curriculum plan. We have that in a booklet for parents. So what if they look at it, they're gonna know, hey,
Yeah.
this church is legit about teaching children the word of God. These are our values. And so we provide that all in the first visit. What is beautiful, and I'm going to give a huge shout out to my dear friend Larry Kramer at Christ Church of the Valley in Arizona. This is something we learned from them. We implemented after COVID, speaking of attendance rewards, attendance patterns, we actually implemented an attendance reward system. And I never
Mm.
thought in a million years that I would do that. In fact, I would have been like, no, because I was a kid whose parents moved a lot and we weren't regular churchgoers. And so
Mm-hmm.
I always didn't want a child who shows up, right, to feel like they couldn't earn the whatever because their
Right.
parents aren't involved in church. So I was
Yep.
super sensitive to that and still am. But I will say, we added an attendance reward system that we learned from Christ Church of the Valley, and it has been a game changer for our families who are frequent attenders or highly engaged. And so what
Mm-hmm.
that means is basically we are tracking children's attendance, and every 5 visits, they get some type of prize. And it has
Oh,
been a game changer for us because our families that are highly engaged are like, oh my goodness, you see me. Like it was a
yeah.
way to say to our engaged families, you're crushing it. But it was
Mm-hmm.
also, it's a low barrier. So a child who only comes 4 times a year is going to end up with something. So pretty
Mm-hmm.
much everybody's getting something. But the Sunday before, it says, hey, you've unlocked an attendance reward, one more visit, and you're getting a candy bar next week. Or it could be a whatever, and those
Yeah.
kids go nuts for wanting to come back. And what helped me with it was in the same way that children, read books and earn prizes at school.
Exactly.
We weren't trying to over gamify church, but we were trying to say to our families coming out of COVID, like, actually, your child being here in the room really matters.
Yeah.
And to say to the kids, like, you know what, church is fun, and they have loved. And we have seen more consistent engagement in our frequent and highly engaged families since we implemented this system. So I throw it out there to say something to consider
Yeah.
is how are we actually, because I think we work hard to get guests, but we're asking ourselves, are we working hard to keep the people that we have? And
Yeah.
helping those children see, oh, wow, like you've made it to church 20 times this year. That's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And watching their faces light up of how proud they are is a huge win. And the parents are very proud as well. So it's
Yeah.
been
That's
a great
interesting.
addition.
Do you hand out the gifts in kids' church? Like, when do you hand out the rewards?
So we do it in elementary only because the
Okay.
preschoolers would not, that would be a little bit of, you can imagine the meltdowns.
Oh,
They
yes.
get, they get, uh, they get fruit snacks every week. They get a prize every week, regardless,
Oh,
just for being
yes.
there.
Yep.
But in elementary, we actually, it's at toward the end of our service, we have a portion in our service called HK Celebrate, and we shout out the children who are earning their prizes, and the peers cheer for them. And it's, it takes a couple of seconds.
Yeah.
But our check-in team prepares those and brings them to the classroom. And then that gives them an additional serve
Yeah.
aspect to their serve. Excuse me. And it's been a huge win for us. So
Yeah.
shout out CCV. Mm-hmm.
Yay. Love that. That's so sweet of just, I love what you said about how you're recognizing the already engaged families of saying like,
Yes,
hey,
yes.
I see you're here. I see you're choosing to participate in our church family on Sundays when you could be doing fill in the blank with whatever you could be doing, watching sports,
Right.
going to a sports game, doing all these things. And I think that's like something that's really special for families who are consistent. They just show up and they're a part of the church family and they're here and they're worshiping together and they're bringing their kids. And I think it does add a level of the desire to engage for those maybe who families who are not sure if they're going to wake up and go to church in the morning, and
For
just
sure.
making that decision on Saturday night to go on Sunday morning, and they're there and they're being celebrated for it. Do you feel like this has engaged the families that maybe are really inconsistent, or maybe who are coming once a month, or kind of like whenever they feel like it?
I think it's interesting what we know in trend in tracking it is we've had more families that were coming twice a month move to three. More of the three times
Okay.
have moved to four, right? You still have your once a monthers, right? And
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, those children will earn prizes as they
Yeah.
go. I think one of the benefits of online ministry, it's beautiful. We're all thankful that we have it. But one of the potential downsides for us in family ministry is sometimes when mom and dad know they can sit at home in their PJs and
Yes.
watch church, right? So that's been one of our focuses as a church, just with the next gen in general, and really started with a rally cry from our pastor, is just how important it is for the next generation to be in the room, and for families to actually physically be together in church. So yes, I think we have seen it move the needle. And to your point, it has just been such a fun way to celebrate. I think parents are so looking for encouragement, and I think how special
Yeah.
it is. Like mom and dad, one of our jobs in Next Gen Ministry is to really cheer on a mom and dad. And when they get up and get three kids ready for church, like they need to feel like their church
Yep.
sees them and is celebrating. And if a prize for their kid brings joy, then praise God, because at the end of the day,
Yeah.
the parents are the heroes, and we want to acknowledge those milestones along the way. Like, look at what a great job you're doing parenting your child today. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a
Yeah.
good thing. It's a win-win.
I love that. You win, the parents win, the kids win,
Exactly.
everybody wins. It's great. Okay, we're going to jump back to kids ministry, but
Yeah.
leaders specifically. So I want to kind of speak about, we've talked about parents, we talked about kids. I want to kind of talk about the kids ministry leader, as like you oversee how many kids ministry pastors or directors are on your staff?
Well, that's a great question. So, 30, in the 30-ish number
Okay.
of full-time staff. Um, across church life, we have 40, right at 4,800 people that serve in kids ministry at Church of the Highlands. Just shy
Oh
of,
my
yeah,
goodness.
4752, I think was last month's number. And that would be our what we call our dream team, our volunteer base for kids ministry. And that would be four teams. That would be our nursery, preschool, elementary, our kids check-in, and then Highlands Haven, which is our special needs ministry. Those would be the
Okay.
four teams that make up what we consider to be Highlands kids. So yes, those leaders do an incredible job shepherding a lot of volunteers or dream teamers.
That's awesome. Okay, so my question for you is, what do you feel like is the biggest frustration or hurdle or just thing that's facing kids ministry leaders today? Where do you feel like is the biggest issue or point of conversation for specifically kids ministry staff
For staff,
members?
yes.
Yep.
Yeah, having been in this for a while, I think I have a lot to say. I think the biggest thing that I see is the potential siloing effect, if I can
Mhm.
be transparent, that
Yeah.
how how do we bring vision alignment for the whole church and kids ministry be a part of that? And so I think the biggest issue that I would say I hear most children's ministry leaders perhaps have frustration with is that sometimes it can feel, like we're to the side, perhaps.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that we've worked really hard to do, and my encouragement to every kids ministry leader in this space is, I think my main job for me, as the children's pastor here, is I need to be the chief cheerleader for Highlands kids,
Yeah.
to everyone, to my senior pastor, to campus pastors, to the other leaders around me, to the church as a whole. So I think my encouragement would be, how much can we bring alignment so that people don't see kids ministry as a side thing? So
Mm-hmm.
practical examples of how we've done that here. Everything that we do is to create alignment. So we call our leaders small group leaders because we have small groups at Church of the Highlands. Our kids
Yeah.
fill out prayer cards every single Sunday in church. Why? Because their parents are filling out prayer cards. And like right now during 21 days of prayer, thousands of prayer cards are being prayed over every single day right now in our prayer
Mm-hmm.
services, that children have filled out. Well, that
Yeah.
one decision to add those prayer cards to our ministry flow and have them be a part of our regular intercession meetings has done more to raise the value and raise the awareness of who we are as a kids ministry than probably any other decision I've ever implemented. Or how
Wow.
we do worship, how we bring. So I think one of the things I would say, if a kids ministry leader is feeling like, I'm over here, I always start with myself and say, okay, well, Beth, well, how am I in alignment? So,
Yeah.
example, we do prison ministry as a church. It's huge
Mm-hmm.
for us. We're in 23 campuses. So at Christmas, our kids are writing letters and making Christmas cards for the inmates of the Alabama Department of Corrections. Why? Because it's vision alignment. And so
Yeah.
because we have alignment, we actually have a lot of support, a lot of respect, right? So I always think it's our job is to raise the value of Highlands
Mm-hmm.
kids to every leader around us. And so
Yeah.
I always ask myself, are we carrying ourselves in a way that people understand how amazing this ministry is, how many lives are being changed? So yeah, I think that is the main tension. And I think some of those strategies I've just shared hopefully help. Like, what can I do? And then the
Yep.
other thing is, every year I think you should meet with your senior leader or your senior leadership team and ask their input. I think a lot of times,
Yes.
because kids ministry is seen as such an expertise, we go off in our little space and we plan and we dream and we are the experts. That's beautiful. But at the end of the day, like, my senior pastor has a few things he cares about when it comes to kids
Mm-hmm.
ministry. And I need to ask him, hey, is there any, and it's not always a ton, but there are 3 or 4 nuggets he's given me through the years that have greatly shaped how I do things. If I had never had the
Yeah.
courage to schedule that meeting, I wouldn't have those guiding filters. And so I think,
Exactly.
with that type of engagement at every level, for us, kids ministry is incredibly celebrated as a church, and it's
Mm-hmm.
incredible. It's talked about all the time. But I had to work hard to posture us to a place to get where we had that equity. And
Yeah.
a lot of it came from alignment and learning to advocate in a way that's not from an insecure place, but in a way that's like, hey, I'm going to raise awareness. This
Mm-hmm.
is happening.
Yeah. I love that. And I think the alignment piece is so key because I think sometimes kids ministry leaders are like, oh, this idea that I saw on Facebook is such a great idea. We should do it, instead of saying, okay, wait, stop. What is my church already doing
Yes.
that I can come alongside, bring the kids with me, and do as a whole church? I love your prayer card example. I think that's such a brilliant way to just bring awareness. And those people who are praying over those prayer cards are probably so in love with these kids writing prayer requests that their hearts
Right.
are being like so filled with joy because kids are asking things of God. And that's an incredible way. I mean, I think we're coming into fall. Christmas is around the corner. And I think
Right.
Advent is like such a practical way for the church from birth all the way to senior adults, is like, how can we be aligned? Well, are they doing an Advent series? It's an easy thing to adapt for a kids ministry. Is you still do all the fun crafts that come with your curriculum, but if you are teaching the same thing as the adults are learning, how fun is that for the whole church to be on the same page in terms of teaching? Or it's like missions opportunities. Well, don't go
Yes.
and pick another missions organization. Pick the people who your church is already partnering with and say, hey, how can our kids come along and help you further the mission of your organization? And so I think the alignment is such a huge piece. And I mean, I love what you said about sharing the wins. And I think now my encouragement for kids ministry leaders is write a couple of those God stories from the summer programming, from your summer
Yes.
events, and go to your next staff meeting and say like, hey, can I share 3 things that I saw God do in our kids ministry programming this summer, and just share them. You're not bragging. You're highlighting God's faithfulness and goodness and the work that he's been able to accomplish through probably not you, but your volunteers who volunteered their time to be there.
100%. I
And so
think
it's
it's
like
like
share those things.
I think the power of story, it's like one of the things we train our staff on the most is, to be looking for stories and sharing
Yeah.
stories. Because, the Bible says we overcome by the blood of the Lamb, the word of the testimony. The power of the testimony produces hope and change in people's lives. And, the interesting thing with kids ministry is a third grader is not going to probably look at you and say thank you, right? So that means
Yep.
we have to work even harder. Those stories are happening, but we have to have eyes to see and ears to hear and become master story curators and master story tellers. And I think that's really, for every children's staff person, I would think that's probably one of the things I work on the most is vision casting and storytelling.
Yeah.
Because, all of us can forget our why. Our hearts are prone to wander, right? And so all of us have to be brought back into why we do what we do. And stories certainly help, remind our human hearts of the incredible things God is doing in our midst. Because sometimes in the grind of Sunday, people can forget that, right? And
Yep,
so
for sure.
leaders help put that in front of them all the time.
Yeah. I always laugh because sometimes you hear this big God story or a kid's telling it and they're just like saying it so nonchalantly, like, yeah, this happened. And you're like, what happened? Like, that's a huge like God moment. Like, look at what God had done. And they're just like so normal. They're like, yeah, of course God did that.
Yeah.
And so sometimes these kids don't like think of it as like some big thing that's like we're shouting from the rooftops, and then you can hear that. And so much of the importance of story is not just for you and your fellow staff members, but it's for your volunteers. And it's how you recruit volunteers of like, look at what God is doing. Come be a part of what God's doing in our ministry. So I
Well, and I
agree.
would say too, I mean, as much as, we can all have love-hate relationships with social media, it has its ups and its downs, but I think there is
Yep.
something to be said for carefully watching. I'll share this a couple of years ago, and we found this on Facebook. A mom who had been a part of our church, her family had moved, her husband was military, moved to a neighboring state. He was deployed. She was in a dark place, very depressed, children struggling with behavior. She had come back to one of our locations. It was actually in Auburn, and to visit family. And she actually drew a line in the sand with the Lord that day. She wrote on Facebook that she told God, if they call me, they being the nursery, if they call me, because this one child really struggles with separation anxiety. We didn't know that. If they call me, God, I'm done. Like she was at the end of her
Mm,
rope. She had drawn a line in the sand with the Lord. She was very depressed, husband deployed, high stress situation. Well, of course, our precious team doesn't know that. Kids crying to the point that they're throwing up. You know how it is
yep.
on a
Oh
rough day
yeah.
in the
Been there.
nursery.
Been there.
And of course, we page mom, and she comes, burst into tears. And I love the power of like volunteers, dream teamers, seeing a moment. They saw her pain and they put her in an empty classroom. 2 women sat with her. What's your favorite drink? Diet Coke. What's your favorite candy? Found her favorite chocolate bar and sat with her for
Mm,
45 minutes as she cried and truly ministered life to this mom. And so we
yeah.
found out, again, that's a story that happens in all of our churches probably every single Sunday. But we
Yep.
knew because of Facebook. And she wrote, I never knew a Diet Coke and a chocolate bar and 2 women who loved me
Mm-hmm.
could restore my faith and hope. She said, I am more determined than ever to go back to Georgia to find a church, and I'm going to
Mm,
commit to having my kids there, and believing God to be with me even when my husband is deployed. And you're just like,
yeah.
that one story put wind in the sails of every woman or every person who serves in the nursery at all of our campuses. It didn't matter
Yep.
that it just happened at that one location. It's like, oh my goodness,
Yeah.
these are the everyday miracles that people that serve in kids ministry are helping facilitate. We have no idea. A Diet Coke and a chocolate bar and a listening ear
Yeah.
changed the trajectory for a mom and some small children that day who desperately needed hope and needed
Yeah.
God to say, God used them to say to that mom, I see you. And
Yep.
that is like the miracle of what we get to be part of. Sorry, I could go on and on about stuff like that.
No,
That just,
that's awesome. We love those stories. We love those stories. And I bet you have so many other stories that you could share. And I wish we could just have like a 2 hour long podcast, but unfortunately we can't do that.
Yeah.
But I'm so grateful that you were able to join us on the podcast today. But my last question for you, and you've
Sure.
already shared so much wisdom, so maybe you can muster up something else. But if you were talking to someone who's brand new into kids ministry, a brand new ministry staff member, someone who is trying to navigate all the ups and downs of ministry, what would be your words of encouragement or advice?
Oh, so great. My words of encouragement would be this, that God divinely orders his house. And what I mean by that is sometimes when you step into a role and it feels like, especially in our world where it requires such a large team, and sometimes it can feel like we can take that on ourselves, on our shoulders,
Mm-hmm.
like worrying about the schedule, all the things. And I think the peace and the confidence that I would want every person stepping into kids ministry to have is God divinely orders his house. So if he's given you 50 children, then that means that there are people in your house right now who are called and anointed to reach them. Your job is to discover them. I always
Yeah.
tell our team, we are never desperate. We're always awesome. We're awesome because we know who our God is. He is a God of
Yep.
order and he loves those children more than we do. And I had to settle that in my own spirit so I could build
Uh-huh.
from a place of security, not insecurity. The
Yeah.
second practical thing I would say, that's a spiritual thing we have to resolve so that we lead from a place of confidence. We're never desperate. People are attracted to confidence, not desperation. But the
Yep.
second thing I would say practically is that be a learner. So I constantly study other churches, and if you are blessed to be a part of a house where you're allowed to go take a Sunday away and visit, the best practice I have ever had as a kids ministry leader is putting myself in another church's children's ministry environment and picking up little
Mm-hmm.
nuggets like CCV's attendance reward system. I went and learned that, right? And
Yep.
so all of these constant tinkerings have helped us hopefully stay sharp and
Mm-hmm.
not relying on thinking we've got it all together. Oh, no, no, no. There's somebody out there doing something better than I am, and I'm going to go find it and I'm going to learn from them. And I think if you can get that, whether it's through virtual, if that's that, but even better if you can go in person and build those relationships with other kids pastors who do what you do, that has been the most enriching and rewarding part of the journey for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Beth, thank you so much for sharing. Thank you again for being on the podcast. We're going to link as much as we can in terms of the studies that we talked about, the book Generation Alpha that you shared. And so all of
And
that information.
highlandsresources.com.
Yes,
What is
and I
ours
have it
is
written down.
yours.
Highlands Resources. We're going to make sure we share that because there's lots of churches who are always looking for helpful resources, especially free ones. So
All
we're going to make
free.
sure we send people over there to your website. Thanks again for being on the podcast today.
Thank you.